No one could have predicted it. One day, the sun simply didn't rise over the horizon. At first, people thought it was just an extended night, unusual, but not catastrophic. However, when several days passed and no sign of dawn appeared, the world began to change forever. It all began a few years ago, when scientists started observing strange changes in the sun's behavior. Astronomers noticed that its activity was decreasing significantly. Magnetic fields were weakening, sunspots were disappearing, and coronal ejections had become rare. No one knew what was happening, but everyone believed it was temporary. Governments and international organizations reassured the public that there was no threat. People continued living their normal lives, and only a few were worried about the future. But the anxiety was growing. The media spread conflicting information. Some predicted global warming, while others warned of cooling. Yet no one foresaw what actually happened. One day, without any warning, the dawn simply did not come. People panicked, but governments, as always, tried to calm everyone, claiming that it was a temporary phenomenon. After a few days, they could no longer explain what was happening. The sun was gone, forever. People tried to live their usual lives. Streetlights still glowed, cars drove on the roads, malls remained open, although the world around us was beginning to lose its reality. Each of us had the feeling that we were wandering in endless night, as if time had stopped. But the most terrifying moments were the first few hours after sunset. Those moments when you suddenly realized you would never see the sun again. People looked lost. Many still tried to smile, creating the illusion that everything was under control. But their eyes told a different story, a fear hidden behind a thin layer of hope. Their gray faces, exhausted from lack of sleep and constant tension, gradually lost their humanity. After a few weeks, everything changed. Panic gripped the world when people realized there was no more time to wait. They stormed stores, buying up everything they could: food, water, batteries, flashlights, fuel. Police and the military tried to control the mass riots, but each day the situation worsened. People fought for the last scraps of bread, and no one trusted anyone. Places that once bustled with life quickly emptied. Those who could barricaded themselves in their homes, trying to protect their families from the chaos outside. Others, lacking resources, formed small communities to try and survive together. Without the sun, the climate began to change drastically. The temperature dropped by dozens of degrees, and the world began to freeze. Plants, reliant on sunlight, stopped growing, disrupting the entire food chain. Electrical grids, overwhelmed by increased demand, started to fail on a massive scale, leaving vast territories without power. The world turned into a frozen void. Each day felt like a torturous night, where cold was a constant companion. People tried to adapt, burning furniture, books, anything that could provide warmth. But it was a temporary distraction for those who knew that, in reality, death was approaching with every passing hour. We gathered in an old basement, a small room with peeling walls, once used to store wine. Now it was our refuge from the darkness. The weak light of a candle cast shadows on the walls, distorting the outlines of objects around us, making them seem even more sinister. The air was stale and heavy, and the cold penetrated deep into our bones. We wore all the warm clothes we could find, but it didn't help. It felt as though the darkness itself was sucking the warmth out of our bodies. The people were emaciated, their faces gray from hunger and exhaustion. They sat silently, hugging their knees, and sometimes you could hear someone quietly sobbing in a corner. We tried to keep a routine, cooking what little food we had left, but it had become a senseless ritual. The food was running out fast, and each meal became a difficult choice. Who eats today? The eyes of those starving glowed with barely concealed hatred as they watched those who got a morsel of bread. Over time, the smells of rot and dampness filled the air. Water dripped from the ceiling, creating dull echoes that merged with the sound of our footsteps as we moved through the dim basement. Every sound was eerie, every movement felt like a threat. The tension in the group became unbearable. People who were once friends or acquaintances had turned into enemies. Trust no longer existed. Everyone saw the others as potential competitors for survival. Desperation drove people to terrible actions. I witnessed a woman secretly eating, hiding food from the others. When she was caught, a fight broke out. That was the beginning of the end for our group. Most were on the verge of madness, their eyes filled with emptiness and fear. From the first days of darkness, rumors began circulating about them. They came from the shadows when streetlights finally went out, when our artificial light could no longer fight the gloom. At first, we only heard strange noises, something like shuffling or whispers. These unknown creatures moved quickly, but always in the shadows, never approaching the light. But then they appeared nearby. You could see them on the edge of your vision. Tall figures, thin, with elongated limbs. Their eyes glowed with a pale light that pierced through the darkness like ghostly fireflies. They had no faces, or at least no features that could be described. Only silhouettes, movements, like predatory shadows. The most terrifying part was that they never attacked directly. They watched. In the dead of night, someone would wake up and see them standing at the threshold of our basement, but they wouldn't enter. Their presence drove people insane, a silent weight that hung over us, threatening every moment. We didn't know what they wanted, but their presence only deepened our paranoia. It seemed like the darkness was their ally. They could sense our every step, our fear. When someone tried to escape into the shadows, they were found dead a few days later. And then we understood that these creatures weren't just watching. They were waiting for the moment to take us all. In a world without the sun, hope was scarce. People sought salvation in different ways. Some tried to survive in dark shelters like ours, while others went in search of new energy sources, though almost no one returned. Among the few survivors, there were rumors of a city that still had light, the only safe haven amid the darkness. Some spoke of underground bunkers protected from the world's end, where life support systems still functioned. But most of us knew these were just tales. The darkness had consumed everything. Alex, a middle-aged man who once worked as an engineer, spent hours each day in vain attempts to find a solution, to restart generators, restore electricity. He refused to admit that it was all futile. "This isn't the end," he would repeat, as his hands shook from the cold. But over time, he realized that even his knowledge and skills were useless in this new world of darkness. Natalie, a young woman who had once been a doctor, took care of the sick and wounded. But when the medicine ran out, her medical expertise became powerless. She began to lose hope, just like the rest of us. One day, she quietly walked out of the basement, leaving us in the gloom. We never saw her again. Months had passed. There were only 5 of us left. Every day had become a struggle. The basement, which had once felt like a refuge, now seemed like a trap. The dim candlelight flickered weakly, tearing through the thick darkness around us. But it was only a feeble reminder of the light we would never see again. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It had become alive, thick like tar, pressing down on our souls. Luke, the youngest of us, who had once been an optimist, was the first to notice them. He sat near the wall, silently staring into space. His eyes were hollow, his face pale, almost transparent under the trembling light of the candle. He no longer spoke, and when anyone tried to talk to him, he didn't respond. One night, in a whisper, he said, "They sing. Can't you hear it?" But we looked at each other, confused, not understanding what he meant. He stood up suddenly, as if waking from a long dream, and slowly walked to the door. His steps were barely audible, but in the dead silence of the basement, every sound echoed in our heads. We watched him, not trying to stop him, because we knew no one who left ever returned. Luke reached for the door. Behind it was nothing but darkness, so thick that it seemed to swallow the door and him in an instant. For a moment, there was silence, and then, a distant scream. Luke was gone. We all knew it, and we knew we would be next. The candle was burning out, its flame barely holding on. Each of us sat quietly, huddled against the cold walls, avoiding eye contact. We didn't want to see the fear in each other's eyes because it mirrored our own. We knew this was the end. But the worst part wasn't that we would die. It was that we had already lost ourselves. The darkness began to shift. It was a feeling as if the air around us had become heavy, like a dense fog, saturated with an unseen presence. I could hear them coming. Soft footsteps, almost imperceptible whispers that I couldn't make out. You couldn't see them clearly, but the sense of their presence was overpowering. James, one of the older men, sat closest to the door. He held his breath, trying not to move, as if he hoped to disappear. But I saw his hands trembling. He knew he wouldn't be able to escape. And then, the door opened by itself. The darkness poured inside like a black waterfall, consuming the last bit of candlelight. The room plunged into total darkness. I heard James take one final breath, and then he was gone. The silence engulfed us. The darkness surrounded me, and I could no longer see the others. I couldn't see anything at all. It vibrated around me, whispering something indecipherable. It wasn't just silence anymore. It was something more, as if the darkness itself was trying to communicate with me. I could hear its words, but I couldn't understand them, for they were spoken in a language I had never heard before. But I knew this was the end. I felt something cold touch my face. It was like a shadow, intangible, but undeniably there. And then I understood. They had always been here, waiting. They weren't just watching. They were part of the darkness. They had become it, and I would too. The last thought that flickered in my mind wasn't fear, but a strange sense of calm. I no longer felt afraid, no longer fought against the darkness. I let it consume me. It became everything, and we became one. I was no longer here. There was only the darkness, and it was eternal.